I'm so happy to see so many of Tony's friends, colleagues, students in this mini symposium here to honor Professor Tony Pitcher for all his contributions and work. Some of you may not even have met Tony personally, so I think it's even a bigger honor for you to come here and attend this event. Before I continue with the introduction, we'd like to acknowledge that the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries is based at the UBC Conway campus, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. You may be joining us from the traditional lands across British Columbia, Canada, and the world, and we would like to acknowledge the owners and caretakers of those lands as well. On Monday, I attended the workshop Fire Across the Land, Truth and Reconciliation as part of the initiative of the UBC Faculty of Science. It has been really useful workshop, helped me to deepen my understanding of the context of the land acknowledgement, the links between Indigenous people history, what's happening now, and the future, and the importance of and meaning of reconciliation. It is being offered in November too, so I strongly encourage all of you to attend that workshop. And on the topic of developing the links between history, present day, and the future, this is actually one of the many remarkable contributions that Professor Pitcher has made to the field of fishery science. In fact, his work on this topic has had immense influence on my career as well. In fact, I would say that I would not be here giving this introduction without Tony. So thank you, Tony, for this. Tony was the key to two turning points in my career. The first is when I did my master's degree at the University of Hong Kong. I was fascinated by many aspects that are documented in the series of books under the Fish and Fishery series that Tony and Professor Pitcher at the time co-edited. One of it was the reinventing fishery science, for example. The book was based on a symposium. Over 100 fisheries researchers at the then UBC Fishery Center. Some of you were among the attendees of that symposium. I would say that at the time, the field of fishery science was at an identity crisis. And the book offers a new paradigm that places new facts of ideas that are being generated by colleagues, including Tony, in perspective. And incidentally, Tony and colleagues at the Fishery Center at that time had a project in Hong Kong. And my professor at the Hong Kong University knew Tony. So with that, all of this coming together really well, and was provided and offered an opportunity to come here and visit the Fishery Center, hosted by Tony. The intellectual environments and the people at the Fishery Center at that time really blew my mind. Tony and colleagues were developing exciting ideas on ecosystem rebuilding, combining historical ecology with numerical ecosystem modeling. He also champions the need for interdisciplinary science and fisheries science. All of these basically set the focus of my master's degree and master research, and overall my passion on fishery ecology and conservation. This is my first turning point. My second turning point was that when I decided to pursue a PhD, it was clear to me that there was no other place that I could go except the Fishery Center. Tony had really kindly agreed to be my supervisor. And I continued to work under his supervision on the topics related to fisheries and ecosystem rebuilding and conservation. Historical ecology, ecosystem rebuilding, and interdisciplinary science all sound very mainstream now. But at the time, it was Newell and Tony, his research group and colleagues were really ahead of the time in championing and developing these new ideas and analytical approaches. The ideas continue to influence my work and thinking. So for example, Rashid and I recently established a new international partnership called the Solving the Sustainability Challenges at the Food, Climate, and Biodiversity Nexus. One of the objectives of this partnership is to co-develop desirable and sustainable ocean futures for food, climate, and biodiversity. That was essentially one of Tony's main thinking at that time. I was very grateful for the opportunity and support that Tony gave me. Without him personally at the Fishery Center during my master's degree and offering me an opportunity for a PhD degree, I'm pretty sure that my path and journey would be really different. Again, I'm so happy to welcome all of you in here in this symposium. I'm sure you will hear many more of these stories related to Tony, both academically and personally, through videos and in-person speak. Before we start the program, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Newell, Dr. Daniel Pauly, Dr. Simon Suma, and Catherine Kim for organizing this symposium. Particularly, Catherine and Mimi have put in a lot of effort in organizing this symposium and make this happen. Thank you very much. Because of COVID and other unexpected circumstances, it has been a long overdue to hold this event. I apologize to Tony. We should have this a few years ago. I'm so happy to see this happening now. To me, seeing Tony and telling him how much we appreciate him is already a win for this event. I have to apologize in advance to our speakers that because we have a very tight schedule, the time we have in this symposium will not allow us to tell all the stories. But I think the most important thing is for us to be able to see Tony and have him hear us directly. This is a win already for us. I also have to apologize to the audience, both in person and online, that we may not have sufficient time for you to exchange with the speakers. Again, I will encourage you to follow up with the speakers after the talk to further the discussion. Without further ado, I would like to move to our first session of the program, which is on scientific career, ecological modeling, fishery ethics, and history of fisheries. We have a really eminent lineup of speakers here. We have 3 speakers. 2 will be presenting on videos and 1 in person here. Because of the time, I suggest that we will go through the videos and talk first, and then we will use the remaining time for question and answer session. Okay, so the first opening guest is Dr. Beth Fulton. Beth is a senior principal research scientist at the CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere. She has spent over 20 years developing various system modeling tools for looking at marine ecosystem and sustainability. The main themes to Beth's work has been developing system-scale decision support tools in support of sustainable management of potentially competing uses of marine environments and adaptation to global change. Please, Kathy.
Thank you for having me along today to just reflect on the small to large scale in fishery science, which seems to be common touch points between my work and that of Tony's. It's a great pity I can't be there. I would have loved to have come to Vancouver again, but it wasn't to be. So I hope you have a great day, and I hope you don't mind this talk being remote. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge traditional owners of the lands and sea country we meet on today. Here in Nipaluna, Hobart, that is the traditional and original owners of the land, the Muanina people. And I pay my respects to those that have passed before us and acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people, who are the custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania. I also extend that respect to any First Peoples who are in the audience or at the meeting today. So reflecting on the meandering career that I've had and the many topics I've covered, it came as a bit of a surprise, but maybe it shouldn't have, that Tony'd actually worked on quite a lot of these too and had predated me by many decades in a few instances. So it's really been an interesting exercise to see how, without intention, there's been actually a fair bit of commonality in the topics covered. One of those is an interest in actually how fish behave. So many decades ago, admittedly, actually before I was a practicing scientist, actually before I'd even thought about being a scientist, I must admit, I was a fairly small kid when Tony undertook his work on schooling behaviour and what drives it. But that kind of understanding's actually been fundamental, and reading through that research, it helps shape the kind of modelling I do. So if you think about what that means, it reflected that not only are schooling fish trying to avoid predation, which I think many of us have learned about in our ecology degrees or ecology lessons, it also helps them to find food, and they have that really strong trade-off around avoiding predators and actually finding optimal forage. And schooling not only shapes that, but actually shapes the fishing practices and the fishing statistics. And that's been a big question we've had to wrestle with as we understand how the changing biomass of these kinds of schooling species shape the fisheries management options you've got and the success of those. And that's not just an observational question, it's been fundamental to the way that agent-based models of fisheries and ecosystems actually work, where you have to connect those small-scale dynamics, that small-scale behaviour, to the large-scale emergent processes. And that's been a big focus of my attention for probably close to 2 decades, because it influences the biomass trajectories you get. If you ignore the influence of small-scale behaviour on the large-scale outcomes, you can actually get complete misdirection. And that's not just true around the behaviour of the fish in the sense of where they are and whether they're schooling up, how easy they are to access, but also in the temporal dynamics around seasonal growth and their access to prey fields. So Tony's obviously thought a bit about what that means, but in my own sense, it's been driven home to me that kind of observational realisation that fish feed differently in different conditions, and be that seasonally or under different climate fields, is why in things like the Fisheries Adaptation Handbook work that I've worked on in the last couple of years with fishermen across the Indo-Pacific, is that it's not just about worrying about where the fish are and the timing of their movements and their phenology in terms of feeding, which was probably part of the original inspiration Tony had around thinking about seasonal growth, but it's actually gone beyond that to fishermen wondering about what will be the quality of the product that they have into the future. So that sort of short-term effect for a long-term payoff is again another example of where the small scale hits the large scale in these kind of complex systems. Another common touch point between Tony and I, and indeed one we've actually published with along with Telmo, is around seamounts. And that's another case where you've got a small scale feature that really connects out into a much, much larger area. It's an ongoing focus of many people around what it means for production on these kinds of seamounts, the species and biodiversity that they represent, but also how you actually model and represent that, given that there's so many of these places that we'll never actually get to. In terms of my students, it's also had a fundamental shaping of the way that I teach about the consideration of space. So most of the world deals with ecosystems where part of that world is locked off as a land boundary, and seamounts turn that on your head and really make you think about how to deal with space. You can grid it up and try and get uniform information on each one of those little grid cells, but in reality, ecology, and seamounts are a great example of this, ecology doesn't work in a uniform sense. And that's what supports the ongoing use of polygons in my work, is that the ecology doesn't fit into a nice little grid. I think, like many ecologists and ecosystem scientists, I've dabbled in indicators, and Kempton's Q as a representation of biodiversity is one that Cam, Ainsworth and Tony made a pretty good contribution to the literature for, and most recently it's actually becoming an index we're using here in Australia to think about cumulative effects and really explore how the interacting footprint of multiple fisheries changing at the same time can cause threshold effects in the response of that ecosystem, which is really strongly non-linear outcome of cumulative effects. So that's another case of where Tony's work has had a pretty nice dovetail with my own, as is the intrinsic vulnerability of species. So in this case, it actually saved us a whole bunch of pain and work by helping us characterise species. We're confronted in Australia, and indeed across a lot of tropical areas, with having to manage hundreds, if not thousands, of species in a pretty information-poor system. So a number of people in Western Australia, but also Keith Sainsbury and I, have been working on an approach called the indicator species-based harvest strategy, where you characterise your different species in the system into those that are vulnerable, those that are of the main target interest, robust species, and those that have a specific ecological role. Once you find the most vulnerable species in each one of those categories, you can manage for that, and you kind of get the rest for free, which means managing 1,000-odd species becomes a lot more viable for resource-constrained locations. And having an index like the intrinsic vulnerability that William, Cheung, but also Tony contributed into, amongst others, many others, has really made that a much easier process to do, and something that you can roll out to nations as different as Australia or Thailand, Vietnam, India, that kind of diversity. The questions over fisheries management and how to characterise that's obviously also been one of Tony's interests with ratfish and stuff through the years. And it's an ongoing one, so whether you're people at Minderoo, the FAO, the Sea Around Us, other independent groups such as the work I was a very small part of, along with Alida Bundy and others, there's an ongoing question of how you characterise fisheries management performance. I wouldn't say any of us have settled on the perfect set of answers. There has been some insights gained around the benefit of having regular assessment, of understanding what your IUU status is, of trying to address social and ecological and economic effects and taking that broader perspective. But the work by Tony and others certainly started to lay out some of the thinking about that and to prime people to ask questions. The fisheries back to the future concept is also one that is, sort of gone out from the early work that Tony helped contribute to, and those historical precedents at least get people's eyes up to think beyond the current day. The way that climate change is affecting the oceans certainly makes it a little bit more challenging to just look to the past to set what that looks like, but bringing in local and traditional knowledge, having that historical precedent, can certainly help get the eyes up and to understand how there can be shifting baselines. So I know shifting baselines is more a Daniel thing than a Tony thing, but it is bringing together those two worlds to look at what the past is telling us about how ecosystems have changed through time, and what that means for setting meaningful reference points that don't accidentally lock us in to undesirable ecosystem state has certainly been the focus of a lot of recent work that I've helped contribute to in places like Thailand, and is actually presenting a pretty exciting way forward. So that's a little bit of a self-reflection on what I've been working on, but I hope you've also got a sense of the breadth of the way that Tony and the others that he's collaborated with at the UBC through the years have helped influence not only my work, but I think I'm a fair reflection of a large number of marine scientists and fishery scientists around the world who've got broad interests, who understand that fisheries act on multiple scales, the social and ecological interconnections that are really important for answering these complex questions and building up that understanding. So thanks, Tony, and thanks to you all, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much, Beth. I don't know whether Beth is attending. She's real time in Australia. So, the second speaker who is also on video, but we will follow up with a live video recording and in-person participation in the Q&A sections is by Professor Svein Jentoft. Professor Jentoft is an Emeritus Professor at the Norwegian College of Fishery Science at the University of Tromsø. His work focused on social and political issues in fisheries in Norway and around the world. He has written extensively on small-scale fisheries, social communities, co-management, indigenous peoples, and in interactive governance. So thanks, Catherine. Is Professor Jentoft video.
Dear Tony, dear all, since this is a recorded presentation, I'm not sure who is listening, but I assume that some of you are my longtime friends. I wish I could have been there with you today in person and not just via Zoom. I hope this event is not a valedictory, Tony's farewell to science, because I know that Tony has so much to give. This event is first and foremost a celebration of his life and work, and I'm happy to be part of it, even in this way. On Tony's invitation, I first visited Vancouver and UBC about 25 years ago to talk at a conference he organized on reinventing fisheries management. Some of you were probably there. You would know that it resulted in a great book with the same title, and I'm proud to be part of that book. I've had also the pleasure of publishing in Fish and Fisheries, his and Paul Hart's journal, and inviting him to Tromsø to be examiner for my PhD student. The last time we met was at the MARE conference in Amsterdam in 2019. Mimi was there also. Then together we came up with an idea that I have been thinking of since. I will return to what this idea was. You may have heard of the eccentric but influential Hungarian mathematician Paul Erdős, who died in 1996. There was an obituary in New York Times, which I read at the time. Through his lifetime, he published about 1,500 papers. If you know Erdős, you may also know the Erdős number, which is a score for co-authors. Erdős himself has number 1. If you have published with him, you have a score of 2. If you have published with someone who has published with him, you are at 3. And so it goes. You have 4 if you have published with someone who has published with someone who has published with him. With Tony, I cannot boast of 2, but I can claim 3. I have published with someone who has published with him. That I have a chapter in his book doesn't count. I was involved in the developing of the voluntary guidelines for securing small-scale fisheries, which FAO members endorsed at COFI in 2014. The SSF guidelines are a landmark achievement and a marching order for the research community. I talked about them the last time I was in Vancouver, when I also had a nice dinner with Tony and Mimi. There are issues now that you do not need to argue anymore because the world community has already accepted them. The door is open and you don't need to break in. As the guidelines stress, we must not only be concerned about life underwater, but also about life above it and how the two are connected. Therefore, the SSF guidelines call for holistic, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. I know that Tony has been arguing along the same line and that he has worked on many of the issues that are also in the guidelines. We make claims about small-scale fisheries all the time. We hold, for instance, that they have a lower ecological footprint, that they are important for food security and poverty eradication and for community well-being. We also posit that they are particularly vulnerable to factors beyond their control, like climate change. These are claims that need empirical proof. The burden rests on those who claim them, like us in the research community. The SSF guidelines go beyond claims that need empirical proof when they point out that small-scale fisheries people have human rights, that fisheries management system must also undergo the human rights litmus test. Fisheries management must be judged also on their ability to deliver equity and social justice, which is not only about fair distribution of resources like quotas. The SSF guidelines have a strong gender focus and a concern for the cultural rights of indigenous peoples. Likewise, people have a democratic right to be heard in the management process because outcomes affect them. This is why the SSF guidelines talk about governance and not just management. the guiding governance principles of the SSF guidelines need philosophical argument, but not empirical evidence. You may, and indeed should, argue, for instance, that women's rights are human rights, as Cornelia Newell did at the small-scale fisheries conference in Malta just a few weeks ago, then picking up something that Hillary Clinton said a long time ago. I believe Cornelia is well known to many of you. That women's rights are human rights, and that small-scale fisheries people and peoples have human rights is self-evident, but it should nevertheless be said, because it has important consequences for how we govern fisheries. The guiding principles of the small-scale fisheries guidelines constitute the default position. They are the ethical vantage point from where you start. The burden of proof rests on those who want to disprove. If states, for instance, should disagree with them, they must come up with convincing arguments. And yet, we know that after enthusiastically endorsing principles, states often go home and forget about them, hoping that the world will not notice. This may well happen with the SSF guidelines. With some colleagues, Tony did a study of to what extent states have implemented the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries and the ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management. He found that the overall picture was rather bleak. At the before mentioned MARE conference in Amsterdam in 2009, Tony and Mimi suggested that we should do a similar study of the implementation of the SSF guidelines that he had done with the Code of Conduct and the ecosystem-based approach. I think this is a brilliant idea. Still think so. And I'm pretty sure that the FAO would support it. The question is who should do it? Who could do it? Tony and I are not getting any younger, but he has a whole army of Emeritus #2 co-authors. There must be someone among them who could take up the baton stick. The reserve army of people who have published with someone who has published with Tony must be enormous. The implementation of international codes, such as the SSF guidelines, is also an issue within the policy sciences. I always meant that we should not think of fisheries as a special case, but one that offers lessons of a more general nature, like, for instance, for other sectors. Implementation is one such theme, and the SSF guidelines could be an excellent test case for hypotheses that are beyond fisheries. I think our work may improve if we broaden the context and looked at them from the outside in and inside out, and not just from within. Now my time is up. I'll have to stop there. So thank you all for listening. And for Tony, I wish you all well, and that you will have a great day. You be sure you will continue to inspire people as you always did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jentoft. Our third speaker of sessions is here, Professor Dianne Newell. Dianne is a Professor Emerita here at the UBC Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries at the Department of History. She has also been appointed as the Interim Director of the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the IOF since 2001. Dianne is an historian of technology and society who has spent her career examining the diffusions of knowledge in disciplines across social sciences and humanities. Without further ado, Dianne, please.
Tony, I want to know why I'm doing a paper on archaeology. I was asked to talk about history of fisheries, which is a rather large topic, and as is archaeology. But your range has been so broad, as has already been mentioned. And looking through all the topics, there were some that I had to reject immediately, such as seamounts, because I didn't know what they were when I first encountered them through your work, and I thought that would be a bit risky. I have been very interested in archaeology. I've taught historical archaeology and industrial archaeology, but I'm going to range a little further today. I'll be telling stories about the stories of archaeology. Archaeologists, as many of you know, haven't always been interested in fisheries, but they're pretty involved now. And I would say much of that has happened in the last 20 years. John Erlandson, an archaeologist who's been fundamental on the Pacific Northwest coast here, documented the absence of fisheries, coastal migrations, and related subjects in 2001 in a very sweeping approach to looking at where fisheries fit in, and was pretty discouraged. And I would say in that 20 years, we now have archaeological work either as sort of co-partnering work, or led by archaeologists in just about any topic, in just about any period. And fisheries are becoming more important, not less. I was struck by a book, I won't vouch for how influential it has been, by Punet and Stewart, 2010, edited collection, very interdisciplinary. And the title of it is Human Brain Evolution, the Influence of Freshwater and Marine Food Resources. There's a huge story about South Africa, about the South African sites, especially shelf middens. And the claim there is that dispersal along marine, coastal, and freshwater routes implies exploitation of the available aquatic foods, increasing evidence of fish and shellfish procurement by Neanderthals and anatomically modern human sapiens, Homo sapiens, indicates that fish and shellfish were of high importance to hominins long before the appearance of intensive fishing and fishing implements about 10,000 years ago, which of course is a date when a lot of any archaeological study on fishing would be about the beginning. The new research for that book use advanced scientific techniques such as ancient DNA analysis, multidisciplinary perspectives to argue for the influence of freshwater and marine food resources in human brain evolution in the Pleistocene epoch, which is about 1.7 million year period of glacial, interglacial fluctuations in the world. It maintains that human consumption of fish is older than archaeologists have thought, and that fishing definitely predates the dispersal of modern humans out of Eastern Africa between roughly 80,000 and 60,000 years ago, although those dates, of course, do move around and change, usually becoming older. Paleoanthropological evidence indicates that hominins inhabiting the Eastern African Rift Valley, and this is a speculative story by people who have individual research, founded on some of their individual research, that early prehumans would have incidentally, mainly in the lakes of the Rift Valley, ingested small fishes, which were brain-seeking, with brain-seeking qualities, and that they consumed these resources as they moved across the continent to the coast. Over time, in the wet and drier periods, and then you get to the coastlines as fully anatomically fully modern humans, they caught and consumed marine and aquatic resources as the shifting position of the coastline and environment continent changed. Their efficient and continuous systematic harvesting of shellfish generated large and differentiated middens, refuse heaps by its now dated certain dates of 164,000 years ago in the southern African coast. These are a collection of sites in the sort of Cape Town area to the east and a little north of Cape Town, between there and Elizabethville. Caves which were very high elevation and survived much of the changing coastline. Of course, we know now from the work being done on brain enhancing nutrients such as iodine, iron, and in the case of cold water finfish and marine shellfish, long chain omega-3 fatty acids, including DHA, which is considered vital for brain development and associated cognitive advances. Next slide, please. This is the one cave where they've done a lot of work. The leading archaeologist here is a paleoanthropologist, archaeologist, is a man named Marine. And he and a particular student named Giardino have done a lot of work on what these shellfish middens mean. And usually shellfish middens are not a revolutionary item to be spending a lot of time on, but they're showing a selectivity in the shellfishing, continuous occupations of the cave, not by the same people, and selecting the most nutritious shellfish over time. And what it would have meant would be, first, for survival, that is, they were able to survive to move out of Africa, to migrate. Second, the cognitive implications, they would have more wherewithal to do that. Third was the adaptation to aquatic environments. So the feeling is that intensive use of shellfish would have helped to adapt them to aquatic environments as they moved, with the assumption they're moving along aquatic paths. The path that's being presented both in that book and in the work of Erlandson is one that is promoting the maritime route out of eventually there's a movement up through populating, leaving on the east side, populating the Australia, Southeast Asia, and Northern Asia, and then the movement across, not just across the ice-free corridor, that's what they're disposing, but across the kelp highway, which is seen as a highway. It's the kelp forest that follows the seashores very long distances. Now, the idea of it's quite accepted now that this is certainly one of the main routes for that dispersal. And the reason why it's important, I think, for us is that it does have implications for fisheries and fisheries communities. Because the idea is that not only is there the Baranga land bridge available about 16,000 years ago, but that they were able, in fact, to move in geological sense quickly down into the Americas, to South America, and all the way to the tip of Chile. And now, of course, it's not a particularly continuous line of kelp all the way, but certainly it's quite impressive. That was a missing link, because the idea of a maritime out-migration from basically Japan on, or present-day Japan, had some appeal, but there was a missing ingredient. And a very good archaeologist from Simon Fraser, Cladmark, in 1979 wrote a paper on this possibility, and it sort of languished for about 20 years partly because he himself had a terrible car crash and almost died. And, but it just wasn't sort of, there was something missing, but what was missing, feeling was the Kelp Highway part of it. And Erlandson is the one that has been championing that. And his argument, and again, this is now a kind of suggestions, that it would have afforded the passage of simple vessels, that there would be a source of abundance of aquatic foods being on the Kelp Highway, that it would have expedited, I think this is the most important, the long distance movement of early humans at sea level, but there's a constant need to readapt to changing environments. It also was a kind of route map as well, and it was a kind of water break as well for the storms of the North Pacific. As part of the, so in this one, there's some sort of dates, and you can see that the old ice free corridor thesis had you kind of come in around, go through the ice free corridor through eastern British Columbia, Alberta area, and then come out to the coast and then kind of populate up the coast. It doesn't fit with the dates that people are finding, either for the ice free corridor or for the coastal sites. So there has been, in the last 20 years, a lot of work done, of course, on this coast of Alaska. The early presence of dynamic fishing activities at fish habitat locations in the northwest coastal or northeast coastal region of the Pacific, from the Bering Sea, Alaska to Northern California. There's a reanalysis, one big project on archaeological fish bones from sites throughout southern Alaska using Jentoft, I can never say that material, DNA analysis confirmed that late Paleolithic residents were consuming herring at least 10,000 years ago. And then there's the big projects on clam gardens, which are going to sort of popping up everywhere. And they're quite fascinating because they say a lot about how we would once have approached archaeology. These clam gardens were often mentioned in, were brought up when anthropologists and archaeologists were first doing their work on the coast, but they often weren't really recorded. And there's a feeling that in part it's because it was the women telling the stories, but also in part because they weren't taken seriously as a sort of fishing activity. And they're actually very complex, and the more work that's done, there's papers that come out every year and summaries of what's already known. We realize how complex they actually were and what kind of knowledge there had to be about the local environment. They modified the archaeological finds of them being dated to 3,500 years. It's sort of cut off because of changing sea levels, but they have found evidence now that suggests that there will be more sites underneath older sites. And they found from these sites that they were modified, repaired, cleaned, raked, rebuilt in response to infilling, which was a slow process, but also changing sea levels. That shellfish, hash, and gravel was added and to these sites, and there was really quite a production. And I just recently found out from a colleague that in the site that they have in their territory, they found that there's a big space behind these walled terraces that extend the sea forward for this harvesting. That they have a site sort of dug into the shelf of the back of it, that is kind of a cold storage area for putting some of the seafood that would have to stay a little longer. But they were able to go down and take it out, but everything is larger. It also attracts all kinds of prey that become food as well, and that often people, the local communities would fish off the walls themselves to get closer to the near shore. And altogether, they're really quite fascinating. I understand that slave tooth have sea gardens, and I know that on the mainland and islands, they're becoming quite common now, each very different. And sometimes they were rebuilt, they were shut down and rebuilt somewhere else if there was disease or if there was a change in the sea level. There's also Daisy Cove Cave Rock Shelter Complex in Central California Channel Islands, where inhabitants between 11,500 and 8,400 years ago targeted a variety of marine species and types of fish habitats and employed an array of harvesting techniques. This is these are very famous sites, and they're well known to people who are working, as Tony has, on what was in the sea early on, when did overfishing begin, and so on. And they had some serious overfishing problems there very early on. Okay, I'm just going back to just to be able to show you this maritime route did indeed go down to the southern tip, although not all of, even most of South America has been easy to investigate. But there is one site that really, there's a series of sites that really intrigues me, and that is 6,000-year-old before present residential seashore fishing settlements at the northern end of Chile. Most of the sites actually are in the southern part of Chile and the northern end of Peru and the northern end of Chile. Residential fishing settlements that were linked by foot trail all along the coast and in the lower river area. They had temporary production sites for boats because they were fishing in open water mammals and sea mammals and large fish. They had trails that went inland up to the Atacama Desert, and where they met oasis-based providers of trade items from the salt flats there. And this pattern of fishing and trading their preserved fish continued into the early 19th century. So there are also oral accounts by descendants about these trails, and they continue to use them, and there's oral histories and government records and so on of it, which is always the interesting part for archaeologists to be able to bring in those kinds of confirmations and extra information. My last one is on the other side of the world, Catherine. And Tony will recognize this because this map from Lima is from your study, 2015, on the processing side, which is really what I spend most of my time on, or have, garum production in the Mediterranean on the other side of the world, in the Mediterranean and Black Sea region. Not all of the Mediterranean, mostly Western and Northern. During classical antiquity, fishing, especially fish processing, drying and salting, and fish oil and fermented fish sauces were trade commodities within the empires. And the lead person here actually does almost all of the publishing on garum is R.I. Curtis. He indicates that the fish products of this area were more widely traded in spatial and social terms than was a salted fish per se. So this extra production, what you do is you would put fish guts, blood, different things to get different flavors, but put it in salt and let it ferment, and then drain off you can drain off the liquid. You could use it as paste and liquid, or you can use it as a sauce. And that it was used as a condiment and by all the population, with different qualities, of course. And the terracotta vessels that had distinctive shapes that were identified with salt contents and garum were used for market sales and distant trade, and that these archaeologists have become interested in them to see how far how far goods would go and so on, who was getting them, who was making them. But have really started to excavate the workshops or factories where these were produced, huge volume of production. And they're traveling far from source. The largest Roman salt fish production evidence excavated so far about 10 years ago in the region was Lixus, the Roman provincial city in the Atlantic coast of modern-day Morocco. This archaeological site contains the remaining of 10 factories and housed large rectangular salting vats having a total capacity of 1 million liters of product at a time. This map also shows an ancient Roman, or a new one that's found in Israel, which is sort of a puzzle to them because they tended not to be built in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's a vast site, and these are quite intricate. So it seems that there's not much more to be said about them, but Tony, this, and your map is terrific, but apparently it's a much messier story. So they're finding there's a whole book now written. I haven't looked at it closely, but that they actually, as they ship the goods, they ship them in stages, different stages of production. So the production was to continue. I think of like a concrete, like one of the big rolling concrete mixers that's sort of on its way to do its job, it's mixing away. So they think that this is being shipped around, that the vessels are being reused. And so whatever shows up in another town could be just something on its way somewhere else at a different stage of production. So there's always it's always messy, and there's always something more to do. Tony, so I wanted to thank you, as others have, Tony, for choosing to make UBC your home and bringing so much to us here. You've had many great special years here and created a great team, facilitated so much work which you participated in yourself. And I just hope you feel today is something special and the respect that people have for your work. And I want to thank you for all the seamounts to steal a line from Daniel Polly. I didn't get to bring seamounts in except in the closing words, but thank you very much for all you've done.
Thank you so much, Dianne.
Thank you for your
Sure.
It's difficult for me to keep quiet,
Please.
especially when I get excited by Dianne's.
I know, right?
I was told that I was not allowed to mention Bootsy. But I have to, given that I've been reading stuff about the archaeology of Boots's findings have been superb. So thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Dianne. So, unfortunately, I think we are running out of time. As I said, I apologize in advance that we don't have a lot of time for direct exchange, but I think it's really great to hear the speakers who explain how their works relate to Tony and how that is inspired by many of Tony's contributions, ideas directly and indirectly.
It's nice to see. I have a few things to say very quickly. So 3 minutes, 4 minutes. So you know what? I like to say that no student, no professor. And I think Tony understands that very well. He has trained tens of students. I don't have the example. Lots of them, you hear from just a few of them. And actually, you've already heard from one of them, our own director, right? And then you have Melanie sitting here. She did her PhD with Tony too. So that is, you hear from her. Then I have one little, I said, Tony and me. Now, you want to hear the story, all of it? No, there's no time for that. But actually, I came here in '95 as a visiting scholar when I was finishing my PhD in Norway. So I landed here really came to Gordon Monroe, who is an economist. So I was supposed to sit at the economics department, do my models of game theory, applying. But Gordon Monroe actually says I should send him his greetings. He couldn't make it because he had an appointment he couldn't escape. That he sends his greetings to him. And so Gordon is an associate of the Fishery Center. He talked to Tony, who was director, whether I could get a text. And Tony said yes. So I got my little text. That was the beginning, and that's the story up to today, right? So Tony, thank you for all that you have done and all that you are doing. Second point, Tony, and interdisciplinarity. I think we and you talked about that. Svein, the history of fisheries. So he has been one of those who actually pushed this idea of interdisciplinarity in the world. And again, we thank you for that. Next one, Tony, and equity, diversity, and inclusivity, right? I really think, Tony, you are ahead of most professors in the Western world when it comes to this, frankly speaking. That, to me, that's the biggest contribution. Tony was open to anyone and everyone from every place. That's Tony. And that's how I got my text. And you can see, and I go to East Africa and I meet somebody who Tony has trained. I go to Cameroon. He says, oh, Tony send me my greetings. I go to Malaysia. I just go everywhere and you are there. Thank you for your openness to the world. I could tell you a lot about Tony, but I have to shut up now. Give the floor to his real students. So we start off with Cameron. Where are you? Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Cameron Ainsworth. I'm a graduate of the Fishery Center, and I did a PhD with the RMES program between 2001 and 2006. And then after my PhD, I did a postdoc here at the Fisheries Center under Tony, studying Indonesian coral reefs using Ecopath Ecosim. Then in 2007, I moved to Seattle to the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, where I built an Atlantis model of the Gulf of California. Even though I'm in the home of Ecopath, I'm told that you can have, that models are not like religion, that you can have more than one. These are my current students, Hallie Rapetta on the left, working on a PhD looking at the effects of changing larval dispersal patterns on MPA placement. Tiff Reitzel is working on an Ecopath with Ecosim model of artificial versus natural reefs just outside of Tampa Bay. And then Becky Scott is working on pelagic feeding dynamics using statistical models and Atlantis. And my postdoc, Holly Perryman, there in the corner, she is currently working with NOAA to conduct an independent review of the Gulf of Mexico Atlantis model in an analogous process to how they certify single species stock assessment models for use in NIMS. The College of Marine Science, is located in St. Petersburg, Florida. On the Gulf of Mexico, we've got 26 faculty and 100 students. And we hosted the Ecopath 35 conference in 2019, and there were a few people, I'm sure that you know, who attended that. So I want to give you, just because I've been away for 10 years or so, I've been very brief in one slide, just to touch on what I've been up to. This is my Gulf of Mexico Atlantis model, which I used to model the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It's actually very similar, in a lot of ways reminded me of my experience on the Coast Under Stress project, because we were at the center of a very large collaborative project, and we used ecosystem models as synthesis tools to bring in all types of different data and to add value, I hope, to those data that were collected. This here is my Gulf of Mexico Atlantis model, and I'm only showing this as the one slide of the result of 10 years of work, but this is the change in pelagic biomass as a result of the oil spill. Now, the oil spill happened here, and the thing to point out is that these losses in pelagic, this is like -5, -10 tons per square kilometer in pelagic biomass, and there were other reef fish and so on. But the important thing to note is that is that the impact from the oil spill was far away from the actual footprint of the oil plume. And that is because those impacts were communicated through food web effects and through mobile species. And so that has implications for injury assessment. So these are some of the early days. Some of you might remember AFCAP. I was going to say, you might remember Melanie too, and there she is. So we have that. Fantastic. I'm glad to see her. And this is Aaron Folks, Aaron Ainsworth now, actually, as we got married. And that distinguished looking fellow is, of course, the American bald eagle, and beside him, Professor Fisher. Now, I wouldn't come to Fisheries Center and present in front of Daniel Pauly without showing at least one graph. So this is it. This is a paper that Tony and I did in Indonesia during my postdoc, showing shifting baselines in Indonesia. I also repeated this in Mexico and found the same thing that Tony and I found in Prince Rupert, a consistent trend where older fishermen acknowledge a greater amount of biomass loss than the younger fishermen over the same period, not just because they're older. It's actually cognitive difference. So one of the best things about being Tony's Fisher student was the marvelous chance for international collaboration. And obviously, Tony's leadership of the Fisheries Center in those years was a big part of that. And it's why I think the Fisheries Center was able to attract the top students in the world. But me, I'm from Abbotsford, which made me a local and a bit of an anomaly at the Fisheries Center. In fact, the way I recall, it was me and Dave Freakshot who were from the Lower Mainland, and everyone else was international. And as a student, that gave me a rather unique perspective, and by unique, of course, I mean poor, because I didn't understand how special a place this was until I left and was able to look back at where I come from. And so I'd just like to give you a very brief flavor of what it was like to be Tony's student during those years. So we're going back to the future here, way back to the future here. And I was fortunate through Tony's influence to attend meetings in Alaska, Quebec, Florida, and Denmark. In Prince Rupert, we interacted with stakeholders and developed a methodology to interview stakeholders using a fuzzy logic approach, which I would go on to apply 2 more times in my career in Mexico and in Indonesia. But for the students of Tony, it was he was a window into a large, exciting global community of marine scientists, and we were given a very rare and valuable opportunity to ride on his coattails. In St. John's, Newfoundland, I learned what screech was, which is an important part of Canadian culture and tradition. And in Aberdeen, Scotland, I learned what peaty meant. So yes, those years at the Fisheries Center made me out of the world like my mentor. In 2003, Tony took a sabbatical in Rome. This was during my 3rd year, but I wasn't worried because we had electronic mail now, and it wasn't long before Tony found the opportunity to invite a number of his students to FAO headquarters, and that was a completely unforgettable experience, and I have to acknowledge the amazing hospitality that we enjoyed from Tony and Val. Here we are enjoying a wonderful meal at their home, and that's where I learned what an aperitif is. In La Paz, Mexico, we attended a Back to the Future workshop. I had the opportunity to visit CSIRO and meet Mexican collaborators that I would later interact with during my postdoc. And I tried mezcal. France, absinthe. And in all seriousness, I'm tremendously grateful for the time I spent at the Fisheries Center and for Tony's supervision in both my PhD and my postdoc. And I'm thankful to him for his mentorship in academics and in the practicalities of navigating a career in science. I think Tony perfectly exemplifies what is rare and valuable about the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, and I'm sure his legacy will continue as we build upon his work. Thank you.
So, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Tony. As a summary of my experience with Tony here, the title of my talk is An Invitation to Grow. My spouse Rashid and me, we both did our PhDs with Tony. We're still in fisheries research, working with DFO, and towards just in the last decade. So hopefully I'm able to do some justice to the task at hand today. So I'll talk a little bit about early days, the evolution of my PhD, and come back to my current work. So starting as a PhD student, the background is I'm a master's student in India, and I'm trying to find a lab to do my PhD, and come across Tony's website and his idea about Back to the Future, and I am like really intrigued by this concept of trying to understand what the past ecosystem looked like and see if that can be an option for our future. So I write to Tony saying that I want to do Back to the Future type of work on Indian marine ecosystems. And thankfully, Tony says yes, so I'm here. So meeting Tony for the first time, I mean, he's really kind and welcoming. And today I feel like that welcome extends to any time I come back to UBC, I'll still have that feeling of the welcome you did on the first day. But all is not rosy. I mean, he says that okay, if you want to do these things, there is lots to learn. So get ready to work really hard. So first year is basically that, grow like crazy. Okay, my animations are not working. So the first of all is the courses. And he asked me to sign up for all the courses in fisheries in that year. And I'm really scared, especially some of the coding courses. And Tony walks me to one of the prof's office and says, okay, she's scared. But so, he helped me get less discomfort and pushed me through it. So that worked. And then Tony brought me into some of the conduct work, and that was really a big window into the world of fisheries management. And then my ecosystem modeling work in Rajasthan, Tony loved that diagram, the green color, so I had to put this up today. So that's how my thesis starts, but no thesis is really done in isolation. So a little bit about our research group. And I want to talk about three things: diversity, growth, and acceptance. So today we hear a lot about diversity. And so this is pictures of wonderful people who, with whom I shared time during my PhD here. And as you can see, we are from everywhere, like Cam said. But not only that, Tony makes us meet very often. And in the beginning, I'm really scared. I'm like, okay, what am I going to say in the group meetings? But slowly you realize that you just have to be present and things will work out. And, something is happening all the time. Somebody's defending, somebody went to the field, somebody came back. So there is this collective push to grow. I mean, even if it's your defense preparation presentation, there are suggestions on how to improve it. So this collective push to grow was really important. Okay. Yes, and the other part, the last bit, is about acceptance. So Tony often, so these group meetings would often sometimes be like potluck lunches. Tony would invite us home for lunch and dinner. and celebrate every single defense. So he built that atmosphere of collegiality where we were just unique individuals. There was no, boundary or boxing us into categories based on where you're from or the color of your skin or gender or whatever. Like there was no differential access to Tony. So really thank you, Tony, for that. So my talk is a little bit different. It's not really on research per se, I guess. But so not only was it about diversity in people, but it's also about projects where they work on. People are working all over the world. And there were no presumptions about where you're from and what type of work you can do and where you can work and things like that, which was really great, which led to many different experiences and different places we went to, like Cam was showing. And there was diversity in the types of projects and the research methodologies. These are some of the main ones that I remember, and there are others for sure. Ecopath and Ecosystem was something we were focusing on during my time. There were many different models, temperate, tropical, and they were very different. And although they are Ecopath models, they are still very different depending on the type of data from different areas, IUU, rat fish, single species analyses, fisher interviews, public learning. So there was this enormous amount of topics that you got a chance to be aware of by being part of the group. So what this led to was an incredible opportunity to understand fisheries from different areas and different aspects of fisheries research and the acceptance of people and methodologies. All of this gave the courage to explore and forge your own path. So that's how my thesis, also back to my thesis, evolved in that way. So there was a foray into single species modeling with Tony's work on historical marine animal populations, and there was a chance to work on length frequency that was reconstructed from fish bones that were dug up from archaeological sites. So that was really, like, thinking back now, it was really cool to be part of that project. Led to more single species modeling work. So Tony kept pushing, okay, do this, go do that. Like I was very comfortable in the Ecopath, Ecosim area, but it was Tony pushing to try out new things. So thank you. Similarly, this is another piece of work on Bayesian modeling and belief networks. This, to me, looking back, this is my best work till date. And that was also like Tony pushing to go talk to Murdoch and figure out this, understand this methodology. And so we did some simulations from our Ecopath model and restoration scenarios and trying to bring in stakeholder perspectives. So again, thanks, Tony. But there were also several dead ends, and that's another important thing. Like when you do explorations, you do fail. And Tony was there to like keep you going, and that today also it gives that courage to try new things and maybe fail. So Rajiv, I know you're there online. So his journey was also very similar to mine. We kind of did both like ecosystem and single species work. Not could spend time. Okay, so at the end of our PhDs, after defense, the perception we have is that ecosystem-based management is really difficult, and to bring it into practice, it's difficult to break into how management works. And this kind of, in kind of an organic way, it led both of us to invest more in learning single species, like stock assessment modeling. Just a bit of a segue here. So recently a study was done, published very recently in Fisheries about how of Canada's progressive ecosystem approach to fisheries management. The assessments that are done in Canada were evaluated, and so 178 assessments divided by taxonomy groups, and we're looking at proportion of assessments where we consider climate or ecological variables, and look at in how many assessments are there hypotheses about relationship of the stock to whatever the climate variable is, and then where have we been able to incorporate them quantitatively or qualitatively, and lastly, did that hypothesis in some way turn into advice? So you'll see that, okay, there are quite a bit of hypotheses, but but our ability to turn these into advice is not as much, and that there is a lot of room for work. So in terms of Tony's legacy and our current work, these are a few drops in that big bucket. We work very strongly in stock assessment modeling, but we try to bring in the ecosystem influences. And right now it's natural mortality and looking at top-down and bottom-up effects, and some other explorations. But Tony's legacy, like it's the bigger picture is the legacy of the research group and where everyone has ended up, and some people in universities, NGOs, the private sector, government bodies. So here is that legacy of people from our group, students and postdocs, and messages. I'm just gonna scroll through them slowly, but you will have the card so you can.
Maybe you should read out the names for us.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Just the names.
Yeah, okay. So Lydia Te, Megan Moody from Malakula, Marcelo and Dianne, Steve Mackinson, Trevor Hutton from CSIRO, Telmo, Annie. Oh, I should say this. I didn't have emails for all these people. It was really Annie's help that we were able to reach out to everyone and get their message. So thank you, Annie. You are in the on Zoom. Thank you. Telmo, yes, and Rajiv, Robin, Sylvie, Limbo, Hector. They're really nice messages, Tony. Like, you would get emotional if you read all of them. But Alida, David, Nigel, Melanie, Nathaniel, Newlands, Dr. Ramon Bonfield. Their names I don't know, people from before my time. Pramod, Sahir. So, yeah, so that's it, really. Thank you, Tony. Thanks, everyone.
Here we are. All right, thanks a lot for having me. For those of you who may not remember me, I'm Shimon Suma. I used to be Tony's master's and then PhD student. So I just wanted to share a few reflections on 10 years with Tony. I say 10 because it's almost exactly 10 years since I started out with him as a master's student. Just one sec. Yeah. And then he encouraged me to move on to a PhD, which I completed here at IOF. And after that, I spent some more time with him as a postdoc working on the Norwegian and Barents Sea before I was working on the Pacific herring in Hawaii. And after that, I went on to the University of Alaska Fairbanks to postdoc there. And now I'm back here at IOF working with Evgeny on the International Year of the Salmon project. Yeah, so here's a picture of our team, Tony's lab in our heyday. So you can see me right there next to Rajiv and Tony, and there's Sahir and Nicholas and Mimi and Yenny and Jeff and Wade. So all of our team from the herring project days. So this is just to give an idea of the time when I was here working with Tony. So I just wanted to discuss a few of the big ideas that Tony helped put in my head and that have shaped my research since. So first off, I'd just like to mention this. This is sort of a segue. I don't know, some of you may have read this silly story by Rudyard Kipling about a lost island somewhere in the North Pacific where the Steller sea cow, this gigantic herbivorous marine mammal, still survives, and because it's never been found there by hunters. Of course, it's fiction. The Star sea cow is extinct. It has been for a long time, but this is really sort of plays into this question of, okay, what would the ecosystem with the Star sea cow still around look like? What did the ecosystem of the Commander Islands, where they survived for the longest time, look like? How did these huge herbivores affect other species in the ecosystem? How did they affect the kelp they fed on, the rockfish and the forage fish you can see here? And that sort of plays into one of Tony's biggest ideas, which is this back to the future concept, the idea of using various sources of data, historical records, archaeology, local and traditional knowledge, etc., to reconstruct the state of ecosystems, these pyramids of biomass and production from the top predators all the way down to the primary producers in the ancient past. So, for example, in the days of the Kelp Highway, or the days when the Steller sea cow still roamed from Japan down to Baja California. And then in the more recent past, so the days when, for example, the West Coast fisheries were at their height, when there were 20-something salmon canneries on the Fraser River, things like that. And then the situation in the present. And then based on that, you can have various scenarios for ecosystem restoration. Which of these past ecosystem states do we want to try to bring back through our fishermen and fisheries management, through our protection, conservation policy, etc. So there are alternative futures we can look at, and this island of sea cows is sort of a twist on his idea of the Lost Valley. So this ecosystem state that existed in the past and that we may try to bring back again with our management efforts, in as much as climate change will allow us to do that. Obviously, we can't bring back the Steller sea cow unless some miraculous advance in biotechnology allows us to clone it from DNA found somewhere on the beaches of Bering Island, but I very much doubt that will ever happen. But what we can do is we can allow, for example, the whales to recover. We know that the whale populations in the Northeast Pacific, here you have some diagrams showing the population transfer of the big baleen whales in the North Pacific, blue whale, fin whale, the humpback whale. We know they're coming back, and one of my ideas that I looked at in my master's and then in a chapter of my dissertation was what will happen to the ecosystem, especially to forage fish, to these zooplankton, to the prey species. What will happen when these whale populations recover, reach the massive abundances that they used to have? And that's what I was looking at with regard to the ecosystem in Hawaii. And then another big idea that Tony planted in my head was this, to quote the epigraph down there in Latin and Dutch at the bottom of this engraving by Peter Bruegel, the elder. Big fish eat little fish. It may seem obvious, but it seems like it hasn't been appreciated for a long time that you have large predatory fish and you have smaller species that these predators feed on. So, and sometimes you even have these very complicated trophic relationships between them, like, for example, with cod, capelin, and herring in Norway in the Barents Sea. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind. And sort of a corollary of that is that these little fish matter. The little fish that are being eaten by the predators are not only the source of some of the largest fisheries in the world, like the Peruvian anchoveta and the Norwegian spring-spawning herring and so on, and the Pacific herring here in BC, which are of such importance to both commercial fishers and indigenous people, such as the Haida. I worked for my PhD in Haida Gwaii with a lot of interest and input from the Haida Nation. So these forage fish, there are only several species of them in each ecosystem typically, but they channel the energy from zooplankton up to the top predators, which include commercially exploited fish, as well as charismatic megafauna like whales and other marine mammals, seabirds. So that's another big idea that Tony made clear to me. And this sort of feeds into my research that I worked on in my PhD on Pacific herring. As I already mentioned, I was looking at the ecosystem role of Pacific herring and these herring fisheries in Haida on the north coast of BC. So you can see here you have these schools, again, that goes back to this idea of schooling behavior, which is quite important for fisheries like the ones for forage fish, such as herring. So you have these massive herring schools appearing off the coast, laying their row in shallow subtidal to intertidal areas for Pacific herring. And this row is very important as a traditional food source for First Nations, as well as to many marine and indeed terrestrial species. Black bears and wolves have been known to feed on herring eggs. Many birds do. You can see in this picture here, you also have all these seabirds and seals congregating to eat the spawning herring. And then people fish them and eat them locally, and they're also a valuable export product. So I investigated this ecosystem importance of the species and the fishery, and how we can best manage the herring fishery in such a way as to preserve these ecosystem services that herring provides, and their importance to First Nations such as Haida, as well as continuing the commercial fishery in a sustainable manner, if at all possible. And another big idea that I learned from Tony was that fisheries are multidimensional. You can't just look at one indicator, such as the catch or even CPUE. You need to look at many different aspects of how the fishery functions in many different domains, so ecological, technological, economic, social, ethical, institutional. This is a picture of the ratfish analysis that Tony developed. This is from his paper in 2013, an even more developed version of ratfish. So there are many different fields on which a fishery can be evaluated, and they all need to be taken into account if we want to consider both the ecological and economic and social impacts of the fishery and its overall sustainability and health. So finally, I'd like to say thank you, Tony. It's been a wonderful learning experience working with you. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thanks a lot.
Really cool. So you guys have helped us to come back to time. And I think to refer to the first set of talks, there will be no questions. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rashid, and thanks for Cameron, Didier, and Simon. It's so great to see you and have you giving the perspective and about the relationship with Tony and his work.